Okay, so today we are talking about social psychology, and social psychology then looks at how the presence of other people, how the social environment influence individual thinking and behavior. So basic definitions before we get started. Some of these might look very familiar if you have taken a sociology class before. So first we have norms. Norms are basically rules for behavior. They tell you how to behave in social situations. They tell you the kinds of laws, the kinds of rules that are expected of you in a given situation. So sitting in a traditional classroom, a norm for behavior is that you sit quietly and you pay attention. So that's what's normal in that particular situation. A role is a social position, and within that social position, there are norms or expectations for your behavior. So, for example, many of you have different social roles. So some of you are brothers, sisters, you are a son, you are a daughter, you might be someone's significant other, you might be a mom or a dad. All of those are roles, and along with those roles, you have expectations for behavior. And then finally, we'll talk about culture. And so culture is basically a shared pattern of rules, patterns of behavior that most people in a given society follow. So make sure that you check out the Stanley Milgram's obedience study. The link for that is posted on the home page here. So basically with the obedience study, they found that people followed orders. People were very obedient to authority, even when the order violated their own ethical standard. And most people were far more obedient than anyone had ever expected. Even though individuals were told to believe that they were killing the learner, they still continued to go. And so this is a very classic study that demonstrates how obedient to authority individuals might be. So again, looking at the power of social influence, the power of an authority figure's presence, and how that can influence individual behavior. Make sure you watch the Stanford prison study video here too, so that you understand the basic background for this study. So in the Stanford prison study, they took these college men and randomly assigned them to be prisoners or guards. You can see from the video that prisoners became very quickly distressed. They became very helpless. It was clear that these men were under a great deal of emotional stress within this situation. The men who were assigned to be guards fell into three different categories. So there were guards who were just nice. These guys, didn't get into the role very much. They didn't start to assume the normative behaviors that were associated with their social role of being a guard. There were also guards who were tough, but they were fair to the prisoners. And then the last category here, the tyrannical guards, these were the guards who got out of control. So in the video, you see several examples of this, such as, guards making the prisoners do menial labor, like cleaning the toilets with their toothbrushes. They never expected that the study would explode the way that it did, that these college students would become so consumed by their social role. They actually had to end this study after 6 days. So you can probably see with both the Stanford prison study and also with Stanley Milgram's study on obedience, a lot of ethical concerns here, right? Putting these people in these very, very stressful situations to see how the power of the social influences can change or influence their particular behavior. Okay, so other topics in social psychology, we'll talk about attributions. And attributions are basically explanations. And attribution theory tries to explain why people do the things that they do. We're essentially trying to explain behavior. And to explain behavior, we can use two different approaches. We can explain behavior using a situational approach or a dispositional approach. With the situational approach, you're looking at the situation, right? The situation is what's causing your behavior. With a dispositional approach or a dispositional explanation, it's something about you, some kind of internal characteristic, your personal disposition that is causing your behavior. So in our example here, we're trying to explain Aurelia's behavior. Why is she so mean and crabby lately? If we go with the situational explanation, we can say, oh, she's just under a lot of pressure. Maybe she has a lot of exams right now. It's something about the situation that explains her behavior. We could also go with a dispositional approach and say, she's so self-involved and totally clueless. It's something about her. It's the way that she is. She is just a mean and crabby person. So that's the dispositional approach. When we explain other people's behavior, we are likely to succumb to this particular error in thinking. It's called the fundamental attribution error. So this basically means that when we're explaining other people's behavior, we're more likely to go with a dispositional explanation, to say it's something about you that's causing you to behave this way, as opposed to accounting for situational influences or situational attributions. Okay, so we're more likely to emphasize someone's disposition in explaining behavior compared to the power of the situation. So there are other biases in the way that we think. A bias is basically a kind of slanted way of thinking, okay? So a tendency to think a particular way, even if this particular way of thinking doesn't really match up with reality. So what do I mean here? Okay, so one bias is called the self-serving bias. And with the self-serving bias, we choose the most flattering and forgiving attributions of our own personal failures or our own personal lapses. So with the self-serving bias, in contrast to the fundamental attribution error, with the self-serving bias, we are likely to emphasize the power of the situation in explaining our own behavior instead of using dispositional attributions. So for example, if you take an exam, you fail the exam, you're more likely to say, I did poorly on this exam because I did not study, instead of saying something like, I did poorly on this exam because I'm stupid. Or you might say, I did poorly on this exam because the professor is terrible. So in both of those explanations, you did poorly because you didn't study, you did poorly because the professor is terrible. In both of those explanations, you are highlighting the situation, right? You are explaining your behavior based on the social situation, instead of going with a dispositional explanation, that it's something about you that explains why you did poorly on the exam. And then secondly, we have this bias to believe that the world is fair. This is called the just world hypothesis. This is basically the idea that good people are rewarded for good behavior, and bad people are punished. So basically, when bad things happen to people, they did something to deserve it. It's like a blaming the victim mentality. So we also have attitudes that govern our behavior, govern our beliefs. So with attitudes, these are relatively stable opinions, and they contain not only the belief about a topic, but also the emotion that is associated with a particular topic. So let's say that you have an attitude about politics. So maybe you identify with a particular political party. You might have some very strong emotions, right, that are associated with that. We can divide attitudes into two different categories. We can look at explicit and implicit attitudes. Explicit attitudes are explicit, right? They're out there, they're in your face, you are very much aware of them, and they actually shape the decision making. So going back to your attitudes about politics, if you are a member of a particular political party, your membership in that political party represents an explicit attitude, and it shapes your conscious decision making. It shapes who you vote for, right? That's a very conscious decision. Implicit attitudes, though, are things that you're not aware of, and they influence your behavior in ways that you don't recognize. So if I asked you, for example, to describe for me a corporate CEO, so that's a chief executive officer, think about that for a second. Describe a corporate CEO. What's the first thing that comes to your mind? So for most of us, you're probably thinking of a man who's wearing a business suit, maybe a white man, maybe middle-aged, maybe a little bit older. So that is an implicit attitude about power dynamics, right? And about who should be in charge. White middle-aged men should be in charge of these powerful business organizations. So that's an implicit attitude. You're not aware of it, but nonetheless, it influences your behavior. Okay, so other things that can occur with this idea of how the social influences impact our patterns of thinking. Let's talk about cognitive dissonance. So when something is dissonant, that means it doesn't match up. There's some kind of discrepancy. So with cognitive dissonance then, there is some tension that results from holding two thoughts or a thought and a behavior that are incongruent. They don't match up with each other. And we try to resolve this cognitive dissonance because the tension is uncomfortable. Okay, so let's look at an example. So let's say that you know that smoking is bad for you. I think that's a pretty well-established fact. You know that smoking is bad for your health, and yet you continue to smoke. So you have the thought here that smoking is bad for your health, and you have the behavior. Smoking. Those two things are inconsistent with each other. Cognitive dissonance. So to resolve it, you might rationalize with yourself and say something like, oh, I don't want to live that long anyway, so what the hell, I'm just going to keep smoking. So a state of tension resulting from two inconsistent thoughts or a thought and a behavior that are inconsistent. So make sure here that you watch Solomon Asch's classic study on conformity. And this study really demonstrates the essential social psychology concept of conformity, where you take action essentially as a result of group pressure. And so in Asch's study then, he had individuals in the group who were working for the experimenter. So basically everybody in the study except for one person was working for the experimenter. And the people working for the experimenter purposefully picked the wrong length of the line. On the surface, this seems like a pretty easy task, right? To just match up the lengths of lines. But they found that in certain variations of the task, subjects actually picked the wrong answer 37% of the time. So this definitely shows this impact of conformity and how conformity can cause you to really alter your behavior. Okay, so another thing that can happen within the group, this concept of what's called groupthink. And basically, this happens in groups that are closely knit, groups who work together often. And it's this idea that within the group, We don't express any alternate opinions because we want to maintain some kind of harmony within the group. So if you have an idea that disagrees, keep it to yourself. Some particular symptoms that you might see, this idea that the group is invincible, their decisions are correct. Self-censorship, that people who dissent, people who disagree, decide to keep quiet, keep their opinions to themselves. And then there is this pressure from the group to conform, right? So tying it back again to that concept of conformity. One way that you can counteract groupthink is by creating conditions that reward dissent. So basically encouraging people to share their opinions, even when the opinions don't match up with what the group is thinking. Okay, so looking at other social psychology concepts, this concept of ethnic identity. Ethnic identity is an aspect of your social identity. It's based on your self-concept, essentially on identification with a particular ethnic group. So that's ethnic identity. Ethnicity, by and large, has to do more with the kinds of cultural customs that you follow. So think about, the particular group to which you belong or to which you most strongly identify. Maybe there are foods that you like to eat, holidays that you celebrate. Maybe there's a particular religious group that goes along with your ethnicity. Acculturation happens when individuals who are members of minority groups. So in the United States, this is basically anyone who is not a white middle-class male. So members of minority groups start to they start to identify with these things that are part of the dominant or mainstream culture. Okay, so ethnic identity then takes us into this concept of ethnocentrism. With ethnocentrism, this is the belief that your own group, whatever group you're a part of, it might be your nation, your religion, is better than everybody else. It creates this us versus them mentality. So I am a woman. So if I were ethnocentric, I would believe that women are far superior to men. That's an example of ethnocentrism, right? So it's us women versus them, men. And from an evolutionary psychology standpoint, ethnocentrism is a good thing in that it binds groups together, right? I mean, if we take this back to hunting and gathering times, you depended on other people for your basic survival. So having this attachment to people who are like you, people who are members of your group, would be a good thing, right? Because then you can band together, then you can work together to survive. Ethnocentrism can lead to stereotypes in some instances. So with stereotypes, we have this belief that them, right, the people who are outside of your group are all the same. So every woman is a bad driver. That's an example of a stereotype. All members of this group share some kind of common trait. Stereotypes are distortions of reality because they really exaggerate the differences between groups. So they make it seem like groups of people are more dissimilar than they actually are. And they also function to underestimate within group differences. So there is considerable variation within any particular group. So if we decide that women are, the group that we're going to stereotype, there's a lot of variation, right? Women are very, very different. And using stereotypes then underestimates those differences within the group.